She moved into the homestead that nobody wanted and ended up finding something hidden for decades, something that changed not only her old age, but the destiny of an entire village. Can you imagine the pain of hearing from your own children that you are no longer needed? Of being put out of the house on a rainy night with nothing but a suitcase in hand and a broken heart, with nowhere to return to? But this story truly happened on a cold afternoon in May of 1893, on the outskirts of the small village of Stony Creek Valley, deep in the countryside, back when the roads were still beaten dirt, and family promises didn't always last a lifetime. Before we continue this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button down below, because what this elderly mother found on that forgotten farm changed not only her fate, but that of many humble folks in this region. The ending will surprise you in a way that might make you look differently at the elders in your own family. What she discovered in that place everyone avoided stirred up ancient secrets, hidden riches, and injustices that had been dragging on for generations. And tell me in the comments which city you're watching this story from, because it's thrilling to know how far these stories from our heartland can reach. On that afternoon of May 17th, 1893, the rain insisted on falling fine and cold over the dirt streets of the nearest large town, and the mud clung to the wagon wheels as if trying to hold back anyone attempting to leave. On the side of the road leading out of that town toward the village of Stony Creek Valley, an elderly woman walked slowly, her dark blue cotton dress darkened further by the water, her shawl plastered to her shoulders, and a small leather suitcase in one hand. In the other, she balanced a wooden box, too heavy for someone who already carried the weight of so many years on her back. This woman was Rosalind Anderson, 68 years old, and every step she took in that muck seemed harder than all the years she had bent over wash basins to support her children. The wind cut across her face like a cold razor, and the smell of wet earth mixed with the familiar scent of lye soap ingrained in the clothes she had washed so many times. Rosalind felt the fabric of her skirt sticking to her legs, water running down her grey hair, hastily pinned in a crooked bun, and her chest tight, not just from the physical exertion, but from what had happened just a few hours earlier. She was still strong for her age, thanks to a lifetime of carrying bundles and buckets, but on that day she seemed smaller, shrunken before a truth that hurt more than any backache. Her own children had made it clear they no longer needed her in the house. As she walked, she remembered the wooden table in her eldest son Arthur's living room, where it all began that evening. The house was simple but tidy, with a thick cloth tablecloth, scoured cast-iron pans hanging on the wall, and the smell of freshly cooked beans still in the air, when she realized the atmosphere was different. Dora, her daughter-in-law, avoided looking directly at her, stirring the spoon in the pot unnecessarily, the sound of metal against metal ringing louder than it should. The children, 2 girls and a boy, whispered in a corner, as if they had been warned that something important was about to be decided there, but didn't quite understand what. Rosalind sat on a bench, her body accustomed to waiting, not yet knowing what was to come, until Arthur, the firstborn to whom she had given her first plate of food so many times when he was small, cleared his throat and began to speak. He said times were hard, that work at the general store in town was tight, that household bills had gone up, that the children needed more space, more attention, and that it was complicated to keep everyone there. At first, the sentences seemed like routine complaints, things any family repeats now and then, but little by little they tangled into something heavier, until they reached the point where he mentioned, without looking straight at his mother, that perhaps the time had come for her to settle somewhere else. She asked in a low voice what place that would be, because her middle daughter, Julia, lived far away in a city where she still paid rent, and the youngest was living on the charity of a shopkeeper, sleeping above the store. Arthur avoided answering clearly, and it was Dora who ended up taking the lead, speaking in a tone that was sweet on the surface, but hard underneath, saying that his mother was strong, that she would find a way, that she always did, that perhaps some acquaintance could take her in for a while. What truly cut deep, however, was when, pressed by his own insecurity, Arthur let slip a sentence she never imagined hearing from him. He said that he didn't need her to stay there anymore, that he had his own family to look after, that everyone had to fend for their own life. The sentence echoed in Rosalina's head as if someone had slammed a door inside her chest. She didn't answer right away, because shame and hurt mixed with that old habit of swallowing everything silently, of not being a burden, of not causing a fuss. She stood up slowly, asked where she could pack her things, heard from Dora that she had already set aside a suitcase with the most important clothes, as if doing her a favor, and saw her entire life summarized in a tight space of fabric and memories. As she collected the small frame with the old photograph of her husband Joseph, who had passed away in the flood years ago, she felt her hands tremble slightly, but forced herself to take a deep breath so as not to let tears fall there, in front of those who seemed relieved to see her go. In that moment, old memories began to rise, mixing past and present. The image came to mind of the day when, still young, little more than 20, she married Joseph on a sunny Sunday in the chapel of another village, wearing a simple dress and with hands sweating from nerves, believing that shy, smiling man would be her companion for life. She remembered their first wattle and daub cabin, the strong smell of smoke from the wood stove, the first dishcloths stitched at night to supplement their income, the first basins of clothes from wealthy ranches that she carried to the river, balanced on her head, dreaming of a better future for the children to come. She also remembered the morning Joseph's body was found caught in branches after the bridge gave way in the flood of February 1879, and how she had to swallow her sobs to hold the fragile coffin in the procession, with one child in her arms and another tugging at her skirt. Since then, life had been made of a sequence of silent efforts. She washed clothes for half the region, sewed until dawn, lent her own arms to all sorts of heavy labor just to ensure a plate of food on the table for her 3 children. She saw Arthur learn his first letters with the help of a village teacher because she insisted that at least one of the boys know how to read so he wouldn't be cheated like his father had been in farm deals. She divided pieces of bread so the children could eat a little more, pretended not to be hungry many times, and when the children grew up and left home, she began to circulate among their dwellings, sometimes sleeping in a small room of one, sometimes in a corner of another, always with the feeling that she was treading on ground that didn't fully belong to her. In the present, the farewell happened dryly. A son-in-law took charge of taking her by wagon to the road connecting the larger town to the village of Stony Creek Valley, saying that from there on she could look for some acquaintance, perhaps Mrs. Beatrice, for whom she had washed clothes years ago. The journey was almost entirely silent, broken only by the clicking of the animals' hooves on the wet ground and the creaking of wheels in the mud. With every jolt, the wooden box where she kept old letters and recipe notebooks rattled in her lap, as if to remind her that inside lay the rest of her history, the little that hadn't been scattered in her children's houses. When the wagon stopped, the son-in-law announced he had much to do, that he couldn't go any further, wished her luck in a hollow tone, and turned around without looking back. Rosalina stepped down, adjusted her shawl, pulled the suitcase, clutched the box with both hands for a moment, and felt, for the first time in her life, the almost physical weight of the phrase she had heard, "I don't need you anymore." Even so, the old habit of moving forward spoke louder, and she began to walk towards Stony Creek Valley, guided by a mixture of memory and survival, not knowing for certain what she would find there. As the rain lessened, there remained in the air that smell of churned earth and crushed leaves under the hooves of animals passing in the distance. The sky hung a thick grey, and fog began to descend slowly down the hills, framing the small crops and barbed wire fences that cut across the path. Rosalind felt her old boots soak through, her feet aching, the suitcase seeming heavier with each step, but her head was too full to think of stopping. Every curve of the road brought memories of other comings and goings. Times she had carried bundles of laundry, times she fetched medicine from the town's modest pharmacy, times she ran after news of someone sick. It was on one of these curves, near a stretch where the path narrowed due to an embankment on one side and a small drop-off on the other, that she heard the familiar sound of a wagon approaching from behind. She turned her face and saw a man sitting on the buckboard, holding the reins of two stocky horses, his wide-brimmed hat soaked and his heavy coat darkened by the rain. It was Augustus Gus Norton, a carpenter and small-time farmer known in the region, who had seen Rosalind a few times in the village, always with bundles of clothes, but had never stopped to talk more than necessary. Gus pulled the reins, slowed the animals, and asked in his gravelly voice if she needed help, because that road was no place for a woman of her age to be walking alone with such a load and so much mud. Rosalind, with the reflex of someone who doesn't want to be a bother, replied that she was fine, that she was almost there, but the trembling in her hands and the exhaustion stamped on her face gave her away. He insisted, saying it cost nothing to give her a lift to the village, and that if she fell there would be no one to pick her up any time soon. After a few seconds of hesitation, in which she weighed her pride against her need, Rosalind gave in, let him take the suitcase, climbed with difficulty onto the wagon, and sat next to her box, feeling immediate physical relief and a new tightness in her chest at having to accept help from a near stranger. As the wagon rolled on, the swaying of the vehicle seemed to cradle memories she tried to keep locked away. Gus, noticing the heavy silence, asked cautiously if everything was all right at home, because it was rare to see an elderly mother walking alone at that hour and in that weather. Rosalind thought about telling everything at once, but the words didn't come out as quickly as the pain had entered. She said only that times had changed, that sometimes children think they don't need their parents anymore, that she was going to look for a place to stay for a few days until she got sorted out. Gus, who knew the weight of loneliness firsthand after becoming a widower, swallowed the urge to ask more questions and preferred to comment that in Stony Creek Valley there were still good-hearted folks, like Mrs. Beatrice, who might be able to help. The arrival at the village took longer than usual because of the mud, but when finally the first wooden houses came into view, with smoke rising from chimneys and dogs barking in yards, Rosalind felt a mix of relief and shame. Relief at no longer being alone on the road, shame at needing to show up there with a suitcase in hand, as if she had been cast aside. The central square of Stony Creek Valley was simple. A small church with a pale facade, a wooden cross in the middle, a small gazebo with worn planks, and a few trees whose leaves dripped remnants of rain. On the other side stood the general store of Otis Campbell, with its well-kept sign and the movement of people entering and leaving, buying on credit and listening to conversations that always seemed longer than necessary. Gus didn't drop her off in the middle of the square so as not to expose her further. He took the wagon to the house of Mrs. Beatrice, an elderly woman with a firm voice and attentive eyes, who sold baked goods and held the stories of half the world in Stony Creek Valley. Mrs. Beatrice's house was on a dirt corner with a narrow porch, pots of wilted flowers, and the constant smell of cornbread and fresh coffee dripping through a cloth strainer. When Gus knocked on the door, she appeared drying her hands on a dish towel, apron tied at her waist and white hair in a tight bun, and opened a cordial smile that soon turned into a serious expression upon seeing Rosalind there, wet and holding a suitcase. Gus explained briefly that Rosalind needed a corner for a few days, that she had gone through a tight spot with family, and that she had no one closer around at the moment. Mrs. Beatrice furrowed her brow, looked the old washerwoman up and down, as someone measuring not just the situation, but the soul, and then signalled for them to enter. She said she didn't have much space, that the house was already cramped, but that she would manage to arrange a mattress in the back room next to the kitchen until things sorted themselves out. While she spoke, she was already pulling out chairs, offering hot coffee, grabbing a towel for Rosalind to dry her face and hands, like someone who knows the value of a small gesture at the right time. The heat of the coffee brought back some sensation of life to Rosalind's tired body. Sitting at the table, cup between trembling hands, she felt the steam rise and warm her face, mixed with the strong and familiar aroma that had so often sustained long conversations at the end of difficult days. Mrs. Beatrice, who wasn't one for beating around the bush, commented that she knew well that look of someone cast aside by their own family, because she had seen similar things more than once in the village. Gently, she asked how a mother who had worked her whole life ended up alone with a suitcase on the road. Rosalind, ashamed, recounted bit by bit, without going into all the details, that her son said he could no longer keep her in the house, that her daughter-in-law thought she was in the way, that she didn't want to cause trouble, but had nowhere else to go. The lady of the house listened in silence, stirring her coffee slowly until she let out a long sigh, the kind that carries more than just one story. She said the world was upside down, that in the old days it was said that children were the staff of old age, but that in recent years she had seen many a staff being thrown into a corner. Then she commented that she couldn't keep her there for long, because her own situation wasn't flush, but that perhaps there was a place where no one else wanted to live, and for that very reason it might serve as shelter for someone who had no other option. That was when the name Sunken Rock Farm appeared for the first time in the conversation. Mrs. Beatrice spoke of this place almost in a whisper, as if afraid to wake something sleeping deep in memory. She said it was a good few minutes' walk from the village, down a secondary road, in a hollow surrounded by large, half-buried rocks that looked like slabs driven into the ground, hence the name. She said the house was old, of darkened wood, the roof likely leaking, the orchard surely turned to brush, but that, as far as she knew, no one had lived there for years because every family that tried ended up leaving in a hurry. Rosalind, who had heard of this farm in passing during old washerwoman conversations, asked what had happened there and why no one wanted to stay. Mrs. Beatrice wiped the rim of her cup with her finger, crossed herself without even realizing it, and began to tell the story that ran from mouth to mouth. She said that many years before, the place belonged to a man named Ernest Kappelmann, a fellow who kept to himself, who arrived from outside, bought the land, planted, worked quietly, helped some neighbors in hard times, but ended up involved in fights with important people in the region over money, land, and debts. She told that after years of silent conflict, he died in an unexplained way, and since then, no one could live peacefully on that piece of ground. According to the stories, for the first few weeks everything seemed normal, but then came a sequence of strange things. Animals falling sick without reason, people swearing they heard footsteps inside the house when everyone was already in bed, shadows passing through the corners of the orchard, low voices near the big rocks, as if someone were praying or complaining in the ear of passers-by. Some families who tried to stay there reported heavy dreams, visions of old people crying in the kitchen, children waking up at dawn saying they had seen a man sitting near the stove, writing in invisible notebooks. After 2 or 3 failed attempts, folks started saying the farm was cursed, that Ernest hadn't left in peace, that something had remained trapped in those lands. Rosalind listened to everything with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Ghost stories were nothing new to her, having grown up hearing tales of lost souls and unfulfilled promises. But at that stage of life, the prospect of having a roof, even one full of rumors, weighed more than the fear of shadows. She asked if the property had an owner, if someone could show up to evict her later, and Mrs. Beatrice explained that it was in a tangle of paperwork. that there was talk of distant heirs, of lawsuits that never ended, and that for that very reason no one touched it. She said that if Rosalind had the courage, she could perhaps stay there for a while, until something was resolved, because otherwise no one seemed interested in claiming that land with any real will. The next day, the smell of fresh coffee and toasted bread woke Rosalind on the small makeshift mattress in the back room, with the distant sound of chickens scratching in the yard. Her head ached slightly from a restless night, full of thoughts coming and going, but her body seemed to have recovered a bit of strength with the rest. After eating in silence, grateful for every bite, as if it were more than food, she helped wash the dishes, tidied the room she had used, and finally summoned the courage to ask if there was anyone who could take her to Sunken Rock Farm so she could at least see the place with her own eyes before deciding. Gus, who had stopped by to drop off some ordered planks, heard the conversation and offered to accompany her. He said he had passed near the farm a few times, cutting across with the wagon, but had never entered the house because people talked too much, and he, though he claimed to be a skeptic, preferred not to provoke what he didn't know. Still, seeing the old washerwoman's situation, he thought the least he could do was take her there and see if the place had minimal conditions to shelter her. He adjusted the reins, asked her to grab the suitcase and box, and the two headed out onto the road, with Mrs. Beatrice watching from the porch, apron still dusted with flour, and a look loaded with concern and hope. The road to Sunken Rock Farm branched off the side of the village, passing by small patches of corn and beans, a few nearly empty corrals, and a shallow creek of cold water that made a constant noise as it hit the stones. The air was damp, with the strong scent of cut grass and old manure mixed with the distant sound of a cowbell and the insistent song of birds high in the trees. Rosalind watched everything from atop the wagon, hugging the wooden box as if it were some sort of anchor, while the wind brought a smell of the bush she knew well from other times, back when she lived on a farm with Joseph. As they approached the hollow, the terrain began to change, becoming rockier, with large blocks of half-buried stone appearing beside the road, as if the earth itself had its bones showing. The slabs that gave the farm its name seemed scattered there, some larger, others smaller, with moss growing on parts and marks of ancient water on others. Gus pointed to a crooked wooden gate, almost fallen, with remnants of rusty wire hanging, saying the property began there. On the other side, amidst a thicket that had once been pasture, stood the house of darkened wood, with crooked window frames, a stained roof, and a small, collapsed shed further back. When the wagon stopped in front of the house, the silence seemed heavier than on the rest of the road. There were no animals there, no rooster crowing, no dog running, no sign of daily life. What could be heard was only the sound of the wind passing through the cracks, making the wood creak slightly, and the constant noise of a stream further down, hidden among the trees, as if the farm were surrounded by a kind of water murmur that never stopped. Rosalind stepped down slowly, feeling the ground a little softer under her soaked boots, and breathed deep the smell of damp woods mixed with a faint scent of wet timber. When she pushed the front door, she felt the resistance of years of abandonment, as if the house were reluctant to open again. The wood groaned loudly, kicking up dust, and a strong smell of mold, of stored things, and of old rats came from inside like a warm breath, even in the cold of that late May. The light entering through the cracks and the open door drew streaks in the particle-filled air, revealing a simple room, with a thick wooden table in the center covered in a thick layer of dust, 2 overturned chairs in a corner, a shelf with a few objects time seemed to have forgotten, a chipped mug, a cracked plate, a piece of melted candle. Rosalind walked slowly across the floorboards, feeling the planks yield slightly under her body weight, creaking as if complaining about having to carry someone again after so long empty. With every step, her heart beat faster, not just from fear of ghost stories, but from the awareness that this could be the place where she would spend the rest of her days. She ran a wrinkled hand over the table, leaving a clean trail in the dust, and thought that if she cleared all that out, if she opened the windows, if she scrubbed the floor, perhaps the house would return to looking like a home, however simple and old. In the kitchen, which was in a room to the side, the scene was similar. A large wood-burning stove, built of simple masonry and covered by a thick layer of dry ash, some rusty pans hanging high up, a wooden bench leaning against the wall, and a small cabinet without doors, with empty shelves. The smell there was stronger, a mix of old smoke with dampness, and something metallic she didn't identify immediately. A thread of light entered through an opening in the ceiling, where broken shingles let the rain fall when the weather turned, leaving dark stains on the floorboards. It was on this floor that the first strange detail, though subtle, went unnoticed at that moment. 2 or 3 boards right in front of the stove had a slightly different color and a hollower sound when Gus, unintentionally, stepped on them. They continued exploring the rest of the house, a small bedroom with a wooden bed frame minus the mattress, a coat rack with a jacket hanging covered in dust, a crooked crucifix above the headboard, another room that might have been a storage area with remnants of burlap sacks, a hoe with a broken handle, pieces of rope. On the walls, marks of smoke and hands, water stains, small holes where wind and perhaps insects entered. Rosalind viewed it all with the eyes of someone who had lived in worse places, with more people, less space, and thought that here, at least no one would say she was in the way. After checking every corner, the two returned to the living room. Gus asked honestly if she thought she could manage to fix it up, because it was plain to see it would need plenty of work, replacing some boards, plugging cracks, fixing the roof, cleaning everything. Rosalind replied that work was never what frightened her. What hurt most was the feeling of not being welcome anywhere, and that if this house, even haunted by other people's stories, was willing to shelter her, she would take charge of driving away, with faith and effort, any shadow of the past. Gus promised he would help with what he could, that he would bring some leftover lumber from the carpentry shop, see if anyone had old shingles to donate, and wouldn't let her spend the first stretch there completely alone. At night, however, when he said goodbye, leaving her at the door with the suitcase and the box, the real weight of solitude fell upon Rosalind like a cold blanket. She lit a kerosene lamp she had brought, striking the match carefully so as not to waste it, and watched the shadows dance on the walls, projecting strange shapes that fed any frightened imagination. The wind began to blow harder outside, making the cracks sing, and the sound of the stream, which during the day seemed just background noise, at night gained a deeper tone, almost like a continuous voice murmuring something she didn't understand. Lying on the makeshift bed of a straw mat and some blankets, in the room she had chosen for appearing less damp, she felt every noise as if it were a warning. The creaking of the floor in the next room, which likely came from some wood expanding with the cold, the banging of a poorly closed door pushed by the wind, a crack in the ceiling where perhaps some small animal moved. And she was certain she heard a heavier step in the living room, almost as if someone were crossing the room, and her heart raced. She lay motionless, holding her breath, waiting for another sign. The silence that followed was even more unsettling than the noise, because it left room for the mind to complete what it couldn't see. Even so, her exhausted body eventually gave in, and she slept poorly, in broken naps, waking at the slightest movement of the house. When morning arrived, with a cold clarity entering through the cracks, the smell of old wood seemed less aggressive, and the loneliness, though still present, seemed a little more bearable after having survived the first night. With the weak sun hitting the yard, Rosalind went outside, looked around, saw the tall grass growing, the massive rocks scattered like silent sentinels, and thought that if she put a vegetable garden there near the house, perhaps the place would begin to fill with signs of life. The following days were of hard labor. She started by sweeping the living room and kitchen, raising clouds of dust that made her eyes water and her throat scratch. She dragged the table near the window to make better use of the light, shook out old cloths, threw away what was useless, separated what could be salvaged after a good scrubbing. She washed the windows from the inside with cold water and soap until she could see, however blurrily, the outline of the trees outside. She felt in her hands the same rough sensation as always, the meeting of cracked skin and wood. But this time, it seemed that with every movement she was removing not just the dirt from the house, but also a bit of the humiliation she had brought with her. Gus returned a few times, always with something useful in the wagon, some planks to reinforce the floor in a corner that threatened to give way, a sack of lime to whitewash the interior walls and ward off the mold, a handful of seeds for a future garden of collards and lettuce. In exchange, he accepted only coffee and a plate of simple food when she had something to offer, saying he didn't need more than that he was already well paid by the peace of seeing someone giving life back to a place the whole region had given up for lost. Over time, the visit stopped being just practical and began to include small stretches of conversation, memories of old times, exchanges of comfortable silences. The village, however, reacted differently. Some people, upon learning that Rosalind had gone to live at Sunken Rock Farm, crossed themselves and murmured that they wouldn't set foot there even if paid, that they preferred to watch from afar. Others, more curious, commented at Otis Campbell's store that they wanted to see how long she would last in that corner, if she would go mad, like they said others had, if she would run screaming down the road some random night. Children especially appeared divided. Some were terrified just passing in front of the path that led to the farm. Others had the curious gleam of those who sensed there might be something there beyond a scare. That was how Tommy and little Rita entered Rosalind's routine. Tommy, a skinny boy with lively eyes, son of a small farmer who lived by picking up odd jobs, and Rita, a girl with thin braids and a wide smile, daughter of a seamstress who sometimes helped clean the church, decided one day to follow Gus from a distance, hiding behind bushes and trees until they saw exactly where the farm everyone talked about was. When they realized that an old lady they knew by sight lived there now, that washerwoman with strong hands and a slow walk, they lost a bit of their fear, and on a day when she was out front washing a rag, summoned the courage to approach. Rosalind found it strange to see the two children emerging from behind a bush, their clothes stained with mud and eyes wide with curiosity, but soon opened a tired smile, inviting them closer, asking if they had permission to be there. They replied they had come just to see what the house everyone said was haunted looked like, and she, knowing well how stories grow in people's mouths, laughed lightly and said that, up to that moment, the only ghost she had found there was that of her own loneliness. She offered a piece of cornbread she had made with flour Mrs. Beatrice had sent, and in exchange asked for help sweeping the kitchen, because her back was already complaining from the effort. It was during this cleaning that the first concrete clue to the mystery presented itself almost innocently. While running from one side to the other with the broom, pretending to do more than he really was, Tommy stomped hard near the wood stove, and a different hollow sound echoed through the floor. He found it odd, tapped the end of the broom handle on the same spot, and called Rosalind's attention, saying the floor there sounded like an empty crate. She initially thought it was just a loose board, the kind that creaks more, but after the children left, promising to return another day, the memory of that different sound came back to her mind like an insistent call. That late afternoon, with the sun already hiding behind the hills and light entering through the kitchen window at a low angle, Rosalind knelt before the stove, pressed her ear to the floor, and tapped lightly with her knuckles on different points of the floorboards. In some places, the sound was firm, solid, as if there were earth right beneath the wood. In that specific spot where Tommy had stepped, however, the sound was deeper, almost as if there were an empty space beneath the board. Her heart sped up a little, and a thin chill ran down her spine, not just because of the legends, but from the awareness that, in that house, nothing should be considered a coincidence. She stayed still for a time, looking at the board as if expecting it to move on its own or reveal some secret without her needing to touch it. Then she took a deep breath, dried her hands on a dish towel, took an old wooden-handled knife she had found in the cabinet and wedged the tip between two boards, careful not to cut herself. The wood resisted at first, as if still carrying the will to hide what lay beneath, but slowly, creaking and releasing splinters, it gave way. A fissure opened, letting escape a smell of a place closed for a long time, a mixture of dampness, dust, and rusty metal. When she managed to lift part of the board, the faint light of the lamp illuminated a dark cavity, enough for her to see the outline of something metallic right below. Stretching her arm carefully, feeling the wood scratch her forearm, she touched the cold, rough surface of a metal box. She exerted force, pulled, and the object came to the surface with a heavy screech, kicking up even more dust. It was a small strongbox about the size of a shoebox, covered in rust, with a clasp on the front that looked like it had been shut decades ago and never touched again. Rosalind ran her wrinkled fingers over the lid, feeling the irregularities of the metal, the rougher parts, the edges rounded from so much use before being buried there. The smell coming from inside, even with the safe still closed, was different from the house odor. There was a background of old paper, of stored fabric, of damp iron. Her heart beat so strong it seemed to match the noise of the stream outside, and for an instant she forgot everything, the expulsion, the humiliation, the pain in her bones. It was as if that box, risen from the floor of an abandoned house, offered her not just a secret, but also a diversion, a new curiosity to take the place of sadness. She tried to open the clasp with her hands, but the rust was so sedimented it barely moved. She forced it a little, heard a light snap, feared breaking the whole mechanism and losing whatever was inside, and retreated. She thought about getting a hammer, some stronger tool, but remembered she had nothing of the sort there, only a few old pans and the knife she had already used. She sat on the floor, with the box between her legs, and spent long minutes just looking at it, as if she could guess the contents by weight, by the muffled sound it made when she shook it lightly. Something moved inside, not much, but enough to indicate it wasn't completely empty. Night was approaching, and the lamplight flickered with the wind entering through a wider crack near the window. Rosalind decided she wouldn't force it more at that moment. She covered the hole in the floor with an old cloth, pushed the box under the bed, into a place where she could reach it easily, but where it wouldn't be in sight of any distracted visitor. She washed her hands, felt the smell of rust mixed with soap and dust stuck to her fingers, and while preparing a weak coffee to chase away the cold, realized that for the first time in a long while, a question other than the pain of her children occupied the center of her mind. What had someone found important enough to hide under the floor of that kitchen? When darkness fell completely, bringing back the noises of the old house, the wind whistling between the shingles and the stream singing down below, Rosalind felt that although loneliness was still there, it now shared space with another presence, invisible but very concrete, the certainty that this house held stories going far beyond the ghost legends whispered at the store. She lay down again on the mat, pulled the blanket up to her neck, closed her eyes, and tried to concentrate on good memories of Joseph, of the small children running in the yard of another house, of the smell of bread in the oven. In the back of the room, however, the silent box seemed to call to her in thought, as if saying that the past of other people, perhaps as suffering as she, was about to mix with her own destiny. It was in this state, half awake, half trapped in questions, that she ended up dozing off, until a new sound, different from the creaks of the house, made her open her eyes in the dark, heart racing. Outside, coming from the direction of the porch, someone stepped on the wood with a weight that wasn't wind, nor small animal, and a masculine voice, unknown, called her name with a calmness that made the blood freeze in her veins, as if even the farm, on that night, wanted to test how willing she was to stay. Some weeks had passed since the night a male voice called Rosalin's name on the porch of Sunken Rock Farm, and her life seemed divided into two pieces, before the box hidden under the kitchen floor, and after that hollow sound Tommy had discovered by accident. The daily routine continued heavy, with the old washerwoman going back and forth to the village to fetch laundry, sell small sewing services, and trade favors for groceries. But in any interval of silence, her thoughts returned to the rusty object now living under the bed. It was as if the box breathed along with her, reminding her that inside that metal casing lay something more than iron and stored paper. On that night when she heard her name called from outside, Rosalin's body froze for a few seconds, trapped between the desire to pretend she hadn't heard and the fear that if she stayed silent, something worse might happen. The voice wasn't Gus's, which she already recognized from afar, nor Tommy's or any child's. It was the voice of an adult man, dry, with no attempt to sound friendly. She got up slowly, feeling the blanket slide down her legs, heart beating too loud, and walked toward the door, holding the lamp with such force her fingers ached. When she asked who was there, the answer came quick, saying it was someone sent to know how the occupation of that farm was going, and the way the words were spoken didn't make it clear if it was concern or a warning. Opening a crack in the door, lifting the lamp just enough to see the visitor's outline, Rosalind realized the man wore a medium-brimmed hat, a dark coat, and muddy boots, like any worker in the region. But the way he looked was different. He introduced himself as an employee of Otis Campbell, saying he had come to see if the house was in condition to shelter anyone, because the boss had been commenting that this piece of land was in a complicated paper situation. He said that if she needed anything, she could look for Otis at the store, that he knew how to handle such matters, and ended with a sentence that seemed like courtesy but had a barb. He mentioned that farms with a history like that one usually hide things best left in the hands of those who understand them. As soon as the man walked away, leaving mud marks on the porch and a trail of unease in her chest, Rosalind locked the door from the inside and leaned her forehead against the cold wood, trying to organize what this meant. Had she told anyone about the safe? No. Had she shown Gus, Tommy, or Rita? Not yet. He, however, had spoken of hiding places in a generic way, like someone reciting a rumor heard from others. Even so, it planted a seed of fear. If Otis was already commenting on the farm, it was a matter of time before his merchant's curiosity dug deeper into the life of whoever lived there. And the more she thought about it, the more the box under the bed seemed like an invitation not just to hope, but also to danger. The following days showed a new pattern. When Rosalind went down to the village to drop bundles of clothes at the homes of families who still trusted her work, she noticed the looks were different. Some people greeted her from afar, with a certain curious respect, as if she were brave for living where she lived. Others turned their faces away, whispered among themselves, and she noticed Otis's name popping up now and then, mixed with hers, in sentences she couldn't hear entirely. Dora, her daughter-in-law, actually crossed paths with her on the street, and instead of any sign of regret for how she had treated her, limited herself to asking dryly if her mother wasn't getting into something wrong out in those woods, because people were saying she was greasing important palms with money no one knew the source of. That hurt as much as the night of the expulsion. Rosalind replied only that she continued living off her own work, that if she ever had spare money, she might think about buying a piece of ground of her own, but for now she struggled not to lack food. Inside, however, she knew that the presence of the coins inside the box, even if still invisible, already modified people's gaze, though no one had seen them. It was as if rumors ran faster than reality, and any gesture of hers, however minimal, gained greater size in the mouths of the people. It was enough to use one of the coins discreetly to solve an immediate problem, and everything began to change tone. This first coin was spent on a cold morning when a cough wouldn't let her sleep properly. Her chest wheezed, her wobbly legs barely supported her, and climbing the slope to Mrs. Beatrice's house to fetch a homemade remedy seemed harder than facing a laundry day at the river. Gus, seeing her haggard, insisted she look for stronger medicine at Otis Campbell's store, the kind that came from afar and cost dear, because if her health worsened, there would be no safe nor house worth anything. At first she refused, saying she couldn't spend on luxury medicines, but feeling her body weaken a little more, she concluded perhaps it was time to let go of a part of what she didn't even know fully belonged to her. That afternoon, when the sun barely broke through the clouds and the wind entered the kitchen door like an unwelcome guest, Rosalind dragged the box to the middle of the room, sat on the floor, and stared at the rusty metal clasp as if it were an old enemy. She took the wooden-handled knife, carefully forced the edges of the mechanism, heard a louder snap, felt the resistance decrease, and finally, after years of silence, the lid gave way with a creak that seemed to echo through the whole house. For a second, she was afraid to look inside, as if opening the safe would release some kind of curse, but soon the need to breathe better spoke louder. She lifted the lid and saw, arranged with surprising care, 3 rolls of yellowed cloth, a heavy leather pouch, and a thick notebook with a grimy cover. When she picked up the pouch, she felt a weight she didn't expect. Opening it, she poured into her palm some old coins, yellowish metal, some shinier, others with worn edges, and her heart, for an instant, filled with a sensation mixing relief and guilt. That could be the beginning of a less miserable life, but it didn't come from her hands, nor her children's. It came from a dead man she hadn't known, hidden in the floor of a house that wasn't officially hers. Even so, the cough didn't let her forget that if she didn't take care of herself, she might not even have time to decide what to do with the rest. She separated one coin, put the others back carefully, and after hiding the box again, went down to the village with the heavy metal piece in her dress pocket, as if carrying a hot stone. At Otis Campbell's store, the movement was the usual, people entering, asking for sugar, flour, salt, asking for credit, listening to sermons disguised as advice. The smell of stored grain, roasted coffee, leather, and old dust mixed with the sound of overlapping voices, laughter, hurried steps. When Rosalind entered, a subtle silence spread, that kind of pause where everyone keeps talking but lowers their tone to pay attention. Otis, behind the counter with his trimmed mustache and a lined vest, raised his eyes, opened a practiced smile, and asked what he could do for her, calling her Mrs. Rosalind with an exaggerated courtesy he had never used before. She explained she needed medicine for a cough, the kind that came from out of town, because the herb recipe wasn't cutting it anymore, and added that she wanted to pay on the spot. Otis arched his eyebrows, surprised, and asked if she had brought money, as if it were impossible to imagine an old washerwoman had any. Without answering, Rosalind took the coin from her pocket, placing it on the counter with a decision she herself didn't know the source of. The piece shone under the weak light entering through the window, and the golden reflection caught the attention of those nearby. Otis took the coin between his fingers, spun it, evaluated its weight, its edge, the almost worn design, and his smile changed nature. It ceased to be just a friendly merchant's and became that of someone sniffing an opportunity. He commented, half joking, half serious, that he didn't know Mrs. Rosalind was so well off to show up with a coin of that type. He asked, in a tone feigning unconcern, if it had been a gift from a relative, if she had found it in the river, if she had earned it in payment from some rancher. She replied it was old savings from work she had done many years ago, without going into details, and asked him to just deduct the medicine cost and give her the change in household necessities. Otis agreed, but from that day on, the old woman from the farm, who was previously just an object of curiosity, became in his head something more, someone who might be sitting on something of value. When Rosalind returned to the farm, feeling her chest a little lighter with the first doses of medicine and her steps still tired, she didn't imagine that in the following hours her gesture would be the subject of long conversations in the village. People who had seen the coin in Otis's hand said it was currency from another time, not seen every day, not something a poor person had in just any pocket. Some said perhaps she had buried treasure with some deceased relative, others that she had found a prospector's chest, still others that it could only be unfinished business of old Ernest. Otis's name always appeared in the middle, because if there was anyone in the region who understood money, papers, and opportunities, it was him. Inside the farm, that same late afternoon, the open box offered another type of treasure, the thick notebook, with a worn fabric cover smelling of old paper, ancient ink, and a bit of mould. With her head a little clearer thanks to the medicine, Rosalind sat at the kitchen table, lit the lamp, dragged the notebook close, and began to leaf through it, feeling the texture of the rough pages under her fingers. The first leaves bore notes on planting, harvests, rainfall dates, records of how many sacks of corn went out in a certain month, how many heads of cattle were sold in such a year. Beside them, small personal comments, complaints about the weather, mentions of neighbors, brief records of fatigue. As she advanced, however, the writing changed tone. It ceased being just the routine of a farmer and began to record meetings at the store of a young merchant named Lawrence Campbell, agreements made by word of mouth and then put to paper, loans granted in exchange for vague promises of payment, signatures of people who barely knew how to hold a quill. There were precise dates, exact values, names she recognized as surnames of families still living in Stony Creek Valley, among them Campbell itself. In some passages, the farm's former owner vented about discrepancies between what had been agreed and what was written, about the feeling of being pushed into a debt that never ended, about the anguish of seeing part of his own land end up, little by little, in the hands of a man who seemed always sure of himself and full of friends in high places. Rosalind read slowly, sounding out the harder words, but understanding enough to realize that notebook wasn't just a vent. It was a kind of written proof of injustices that had occurred years before, perhaps decades. At the end of some entries, the farm's former owner noted resolutions that never materialized. He said he would keep papers in a safe place, that one day he would make those records fall into the right hands, that he wouldn't let his sweat be erased so easily. The last pages, shakier, showed tired writing, with mentions of sickness, fevers, and the feeling that his time was running out before he could fix things. After that, just a few loose lines, as if he had been interrupted for good. That was when, for the first time, the moral weight of what was in her hands presented itself clearly. It wasn't just about coins capable of buying food or fixing the house. It was about a legacy of someone who had been swindled and who, somehow, had tried to leave for the future a trail of what happened. The name Campbell, appearing repeatedly linked to murky contracts, connected the past directly to the present, because in the village, the one carrying that surname and running almost everything was Otis. Whether Lawrence was an ancestor, uncle, grandfather, or other degree mattered little to Rosalind from a legal standpoint at that moment. What mattered was the continuous line of power built upon what appeared to be a series of scams disguised as business. While she thought about this, The cough returned, lighter, but enough to remind her that body and conscience walked together. What good would it do to have something in hand capable of shaking up so many people's lives if she herself fell sick to the point of not even being able to get out of bed? The dilemma began to form, like a dark cloud on the horizon. If she kept everything to herself, she could guarantee a more comfortable old age, perhaps help one or another child when they fell into disgrace. But she would leave, hidden the proof that many other families were cheated. If she exposed everything, she would risk becoming a target of Otis's retaliation, being seen as a troublemaker, putting at risk the little she had achieved so far. That same night, Gus appeared with a sack of dry firewood on his shoulder, worried about the cold and her cough. Seeing the open notebook on the table, with the old handwriting and scattered papers, he realized there was something there more than memory. He sat down, asked permission with his eyes, and Rosalind, still hesitant, decided it was time to share part of the burden with someone who didn't judge her merely as a burden. She recounted in broad strokes how she found the box, what she had seen inside, how the coin became medicine and rumor in the village, and read aloud some excerpts from Ernest's notebook where the name Campbell appeared, along with dates and values. Gus, who had experience with small carpentry contracts and knew how a misplaced word on a paper could change everything, stayed silent for a good while, processing what he heard. He saw not only the injustice committed against the farm's old owner, but also the direct connection to Otis's power in the village, because many of the surnames cited there coincided with those of people who today walked with their heads down when entering the store. He told Rosalind that this wasn't something to be kept in just any drawer, nor to be handed on a platter to someone with an interest in making it disappear. He suggested, cautiously, that they look for someone who could better understand the value of those papers, someone with more schooling and influence than the two of them combined. Father Luke's name came up naturally. Although the priest was known to avoid meddling too much in the village power struggles, he was also one of the few there who could read old documents fluently, who had contact with outsiders, who could indicate what to do without sending the safe directly into the wrong hands. The next day, after a sleepless night where the letters of the notebook seemed to dance before Rosalind's closed eyes, she and Gus arranged to go speak with the priest separately, not taking everything at once, just a part of the papers, to gauge the reaction and sense if he would be an ally or if he would feel too afraid to face Otis. The conversation with Father Luke happened on a clear afternoon sky, when the church bell still vibrated in the air from the midweek mass. In the sacristy, where the smell of candles, waxed wood and incense persisted even outside celebration hours, Rosalind placed on the wooden table some of the documents and Ernest's notebook, opening to a page where the word Campbell appeared strongly. The priest adjusted his spectacles, ran his fingers over the lines, read in silence for long minutes, furrowed his brow at some passages, and finally raised his gaze to the two with an expression mixing indignation and concern. He explained that, although he wasn't a lawyer, he could quickly perceive that those records weren't just private notes, but rather a kind of mirror of bad deals, possibly unfair, that had favored one side too much. He commented that if this were taken to someone with authority outside the village, it could generate big complications, not just for Otis, but for a whole chain of relations built upon that past. At the same time, he recognized it was difficult, morally, to pretend he had seen nothing. His conscience, as a man and as a priest, placed him on the side of truth. But the fear of reprisals was also real. Because he knew people like Otis didn't like having their house's foundation messed with, Rosalind listened to everything with a tight chest. The priest suggested an intermediate path. Keep copies of the most important points, perhaps copy passages by hand. Preserve the original well hidden, and, when possible, discreetly send some documents to an acquaintance of his in the larger city. a man who understood laws and could say what to do with that, without exposing too much the names of those caring for the farm. He said that meanwhile, it was better that no one else knew the detailed content, neither at the store nor in the surrounding houses, because rumors ran faster than truth, and her safety was the priority. They agreed with the plan, but didn't realize that outside the ajar sacristy window, someone had stopped long enough to hear loose words like Campbell, paper, land, injustice, send, city. It didn't take much imagination to put the pieces together, and before the bell struck the next hour, one of the boys who did small jobs for Otis was already repeating, in a slightly distorted way, what he had heard, feeding the boss's suspicion regarding the old woman of the farm and her new friends. That night, while Rosalind slept a little more peacefully, believing she had taken the first step to do the right thing, a man sent by Otis walked around the perimeter of Sunken Rock Farm with the care of someone who doesn't want to leave tracks. With the moonlight filtered by clouds and the noise of the stream trying to drown out the sound of footsteps, he circled the house, tested windows, checked improvised locks, and, due to an oversight of the old woman who still lacked experience with planned malice, found a poorly latched transom in the back. He entered, searched rooms, opened cupboards, rummaged through boxes, turned over blankets. He didn't find the safe because it was again well hidden, but he saw clear signs of recent paperwork and the grimy covered notebook left on the table, forgotten in the rush of returning from church. The next day, some things she kept with care had been moved, though nothing was visibly stolen, which was enough to leave her with the clear sensation that someone had invaded her house during the night. The fear, which already shared space with curiosity, gained a new tone. Now she was certain that what was on the farm interested more people than it should. The threat ceased being just an abstract figure and became someone concrete, capable of crossing the kitchen door without knocking, of touching her things without permission. It was in this phase that Rosalind's children reappeared not as support, but as yet another burden. Arthur arrived at the farm late one afternoon, his face closed, eyes hollow like someone who hadn't slept right in days, and his voice tense. He said he had heard, through others' mouths, that his mother was messing with old papers involving the names of important people, that she was spreading stories that could backlash against the whole family. He confessed, point blank, that he was indebted to Otis, that he had taken too much merchandise from the store, believing in a harvest that didn't come, and that now the merchant insinuated that if Mrs. Rosalind didn't stop digging into these things, perhaps it would be harder to renew the debt term. Rosalind felt the raw weight of blackmail. The son who had kicked her out, saying he didn't need her anymore, now returned not out of true repentance, but out of fear of losing the roof, the food, the little comfort he had. She listened, took a deep breath, and, in a gesture neither she expected from herself, said she hadn't gone to live on the farm to get into trouble, but hadn't been put there to live in fear either. She commented that it wasn't she who had written those papers, she just found them, and that perhaps it was time for someone finally to look at that with seriousness. Arthur reacted with irritation, said old age had gone to her head, that if she continued stubborn like that, she would drag everyone into the hole and left without a hug, leaving behind yet another open wound. At this moment, the relationship with Gus became even more central to her life. In every visit, he showed himself not only as someone carrying firewood and lumber, but as someone willing to listen without judging, to remind her she had the right to exist beyond her children's interests and the fear of the powerful. On a morning when he found her crying softly in the kitchen, with the notebook open and the coffee pot forgotten on the fire, he sat beside her, touched her shoulder lightly with the tips of calloused fingers, and spoke with a care coming from his own experience of grief that no one deserves to be reduced to a burden or a threat in their own old age. It was in the conversations with him that the idea was born to transform not just her own life, but also something in the community, starting from that unexpected legacy. They began to sketch, almost like dreaming in a low voice, the possibility of using part of the coins to guarantee a bit of stability for Rosalind, and at the same time allocate another part to help folks who, like her, lived forgotten in the corners of the village: widows, lonely elders, abandoned women. They spoke of small things like a hot meal a week, a blanket for those sleeping on dirt floors, a shipment of medicine bought without needing to humiliate oneself for credit. These plans, however, only made Otis more nervous when they reached his ears, albeit distorted through other tongues. From the merchant's point of view, there was nothing more dangerous than the poor beginning to have their own initiative, especially if that initiative involved questioning the origin of the money sustaining his trade and prestige. He began, then, to make more frequent visits to the farm, always with that facade smile and a politeness that, to less trained eyes, might look like kindness. He arrived with small gifts, like a piece of dried meat, a sack of salt, or a handful of grain, and between one sentence and another, dropped questions about how it was living in that house, if she had found anything interesting around there, if she knew the history of the former owner well. Rosalind, now more attentive, answered as little as possible. She said the house was old, that it was hard work, that what she had found there was more dirt and dead rats than anything else. She kept the notebook and papers out of sight, hidden in different places, as if playing a game of hide-and-seek with the house itself. Otis, however, didn't give up. With each new visit, he made it clear he could help resolve the dispute over the land documents, that if she wanted, he could file a formal request to regularize it in her name, provided he took care of all the bureaucratic part himself. In exchange, of course, she only needed to sign some papers he would bring ready-made, without worrying about details. It was at this point that the threat ceased being merely veiled and began to take on more aggressive contours. On a cloudy afternoon, when the wind seemed to come with more force from deep in the woods, Otis appeared without warning, accompanied by two younger men, broad-armed and hard-eyed, who stayed on the porch, pretending to look at the horizon, while he entered, leaned his hands on the kitchen table, and spoke in a lower, heavier tone. He said he knew she had found things there, coins and papers, that the village was small, and no one kept secrets for long. He reminded her he was a councilman, that he had influence, that he could as easily make her life easier as make it much more complicated. Rosalind felt her heart accelerate, hands sweat slightly, but didn't let it show as much as she would have months earlier. She said, with a still trembling voice, that she didn't understand much of paper nor law, that she was just trying to live in peace in a house nobody wanted. He then stepped a little closer, almost leaving no space between his body and hers, and murmured that, for everyone's good, it was best that any old document that could cause confusion be handed over to someone who knew what to do with it, meaning himself. He reminded her quite clearly that her children still needed credit at the store, that the village doors could open or close depending on whom one is dealing with. When he left, after saying he would return soon to settle everything, Rosalind stood alone in the kitchen, legs wobbly and gaze lost. While she felt real fear of what a man like that could do, both using third-party hands and the pen on official documents, she also realized that if they gave in now, both she and Gus and the priest would be throwing away the only chance to, perhaps, correct at least a part of the old injustices. The dilemma deepened: save her own skin and the little tranquility she had achieved, or risk herself for a truth that could benefit people she barely knew, but with whom she felt linked by the invisible thread of poverty and exploitation. Amidst all this, the house also became a place of small moments of respite. On some afternoons, Tommy and little Rita appeared helping to water the garden, laughing at nonsense, asking her to tell old stories from when she was a child in another part of the countryside. Rosalind, in these instances, remembered there was something in the world beyond fear and bills. She told of midsummer festivals with high bonfires, of dances in simple schoolyards, of nights where the only noise was crickets and the soft snoring of her sleeping husband before the flood. Listening, the children asked curious questions, wanted to know what it was like to live without a lantern, without the church bells so close, without a store to buy things wrapped in paper. Gus, in turn, continued to appear at regular intervals, always bringing something practical and taking back a bit of her worry. On one occasion, he brought a piece of board worked by himself, turned into a decent bench for the kitchen, saying no one should spend old age sitting on crooked benches just anyhow. On another, he brought a piece of fabric left over from a job so she could sew new dishcloths, which could be sold in the village in exchange for some honest coins, reducing a bit the dependence on what came from the safe. Little by little, the bond between the two strengthened, not like a romance of young people, but like a partnership of two survivors who learned to walk side by side after having already lost much. Amidst this cycle of fear, plans, dangerous visits and breaths, the story was heading toward an inevitable point. Otis, feeling threatened by the mere possibility that those documents might reach someone outside, began to move behind the scenes. He used his contacts to accelerate a kind of eviction order for the farm, alleging in official papers that the land was still under dispute, and that the presence of an occupant without title could hinder proceedings. At the same time, he continued sending not-so-subtle messages through emissaries, making it clear his patience had limits. Rosalind, for her part, realized she couldn't postpone the hardest decisions forever. She knew her time, both physical and regarding safety, was short, with her chest a bit stronger thanks to the medicine, but her head tired from so many turns. She and Gus resumed the conversation with Father Luke, this time with less hesitation. They handed him a few more papers to be copied, reinforced the request that the contact in the larger city be activated urgently, and arranged discreet danger signals for the following days, in case the siege closed in. Meanwhile, in the village, whispers about secret meetings in the sacristy, about old papers that could put many people in trouble, and about the old lady of the farm who apparently had more guts than sense, spread with the same speed dust rose from the dry winter roads. People who had always been afraid to look power in the face began, in low voices, to ask if it wasn't time for someone to hold the pen along with Otis, if only to check what he was writing. Others, however, thought messing with the foundations would be too dangerous, and preferred to blame Rosalind for bringing to the surface what, for them, was better left buried. In the center of this whole web, the old washerwoman who had heard from her children she was no longer needed, saw herself, suddenly, in a place where her choices mattered more than ever. Every coin she decided to spend or save, every paper she showed or hid, every person she trusted or distrusted, all of this was drawing the path that would end up leading, for better or worse, not just her own destiny, but also that of Stony Creek Valley. And while the August cold approached and the nights grew longer, the feeling that a big confrontation was looming grew like a shadow in the back of the farm, fed by recent marks of strange footsteps on the porch and the glow of lamps that now and then were seen high up on the road, stopping too long watching the house nobody wanted until Rosalind arrived. The August night arrived loaded with foreboding, as if the wind itself, descending from the hills, knew something important was about to happen at Sunken Rock Farm. The cold cut deeper, the sky seemed lower, and the noise of the stream down below came stronger, as if the water ran too hurriedly. Rosalind spent the day restless, dropping dishcloths, forgetting the kettle on the fire, checking locks and jambs like someone seeking, in the gesture, a bit of security. Gus had promised to appear early, but a problem with a timber haul delayed everything, and when the sun slipped behind the hills, she realized that, at least for a few hours, she would be truly alone there, on ground that was no longer just her refuge, but also the exact point where much converged. Outside, the dirt path leading to the farm became quieter than usual. No wagon creaked, no cattle driver's shout echoed. Only long after night fell completely did the sound of wide hooves beating firmly on the road begin to rise from the hollow. Rosalind, in the kitchen, stirring the nearly cold coffee in the pot, felt her heart enter the rhythm of those steps. The lit lamp made shadows dance on the walls, and her face, reflected lightly in the dirty window pane, looked like someone who had aged yet another few years just that day. When the dry knocks echoed on the door, ringing through the house, there was no time to pretend no one was there. Whoever comes with the intention to frighten always knocks as if the wood were guilty of something. She walked to the living room, dragging her feet on the floorboards that now she knew every creak of, and took a deep breath before asking who it was. The answer came with the tranquility of someone who thinks they own not just lands, but also destinies. From the other side, the voice of Otis Campbell introduced itself, saying he came to talk properly about the future of that farm and everything it hid. Rosalind felt a shiver go up her neck, but didn't let her voice tremble as much as it would have months ago. She opened the door just enough to see the merchant in a well-aligned coat even in the dark, hat dry despite the humidity of the air, flanked by two broad-shouldered men with closed expressions who stood on the porch as if they were part of the house structure. Otis asked to enter with the naturalness of someone who doesn't expect a negative answer. He entered, looked around, commented, in a tone feigning praise, that she had worked a miracle in that rat-hole of a shack, that now it even looked like a real house, and sat at the table without her inviting him. He said he knew she had been walking back and forth with old papers under her arm, that she had been meeting with the priest in the sacristy, that she had coins that didn't match the life of a washerwoman. He said the village was small, that news travelled fast, that he had the duty to know what was happening on lands that in the end still mixed with his family's history. As he spoke, the tone became more direct, harder, closer to a threat than a conversation. Rosalind heard it all, sitting on the other side of the table, hands resting on the wooden top that already knew the weight of many years of work. The dilemma that had been accompanying her for weeks burned inside, hand over right there, in exchange for an empty promise of tranquility, earnest notebooks, the old deeds, everything that could bring some kind of repair to so many people, or sustain the truth to the end, even knowing the price could be too high. When he demanded, point blank, that she hand over any paper that might sully the Campbell name, in exchange for protection and a possible regularization of her situation on the farm, something inside her, which her whole life had been taught to lower her head, decided to stand up. She took a deep breath, felt her lungs burn, remembered the day her son said he didn't need her anymore, remembered Joseph taken by the flood, the years of clothes washed in cold water. The old folks she had seen die forgotten in corners of houses. She also remembered the names written by Ernest in the notebook, the numbers, the dates, the stories of people pushed into misery while others climbed. And in a voice that surprised even herself, she replied she couldn't hand that over. She said she had already given a safer destination to the papers, that they weren't just at the farm anymore, that copies had been made, that the priest knew that someone in the larger city had already seen part of it. And for the first time, she looked directly into Otis's eyes, without deviating, making it clear that if anything happened to her there, his problem would only increase. The atmosphere in the kitchen became dense, like the air before a storm. The two men on the porch shuffled, as if waiting for an order that didn't come. Otis, for an instant, seemed between anger and calculation, measuring how much was truth in what she said, how much was bluff. He knew the priest, knew that man of the cloth, though discreet, wasn't completely cowardly, and imagined with discomfort that perhaps compromising papers had indeed flown out of his reach. Still, he wasn't willing to retreat without leaving a mark. He stepped a little closer, leaning his body over the table, and spoke softly that no one faced his family without paying a price, that she might think she had gained courage, but that old folks alone in isolated houses remain easy targets. It was at this point of tension that the sound of more footsteps in the yard broke the thread of the threat. First, the rustling of branches, then the snap of twigs under boots. Following that, the glow of more than one lamp lighting up outside, as if a small procession had formed in the dark. Rosalind, still seated, felt a prick of hope rise in her chest, mixed with the fear that it was just more people brought by Otis. But when a known voice, Gus's, called her name from the porch, asking if everything was all right, she realized that, for the first time in a long while, she wasn't completely alone before those who wanted her small. Gus didn't come alone. Beside him were Mrs. Beatrice, apron still flour-stained and hard-eyed, like someone tired of seeing injustice in silence, a couple of farmhands whose surname appeared on the suffering pages of Ernest's notebook, Tommy's father, and two more women who worked as cooks on nearby ranches, all holding lanterns or makeshift torches. Further back, in the shadow, one could see the skinny outlines of Tommy and little Rita, in rare silence, with eyes wide with fright and curiosity. Father Luke was also approaching in a dark cloak and grave expression, holding against his chest a simple folder where he kept freshly made copies of some excerpts of the documents. The sight of that small group gathered in front of the house changed the game in a way nothing Rosalind could do alone would achieve. Otis, upon stepping out onto the porch with her by his side, came face to face with an audience that wasn't of customers asking for credit, nor of devotees lined up in a church pew. They were simple people, many of them indebted to him, but who, that night, chose to be there more out of indignation than fear. There was something different in the way they held the lanterns. They weren't hands asking for a favor, they were hands saying, "Enough," even in silence. Father Luke, with a voice firmer than he usually used in sermons, explained he had already had access to the papers found by Rosalind, that he had seen with his own eyes dates, values and negotiations linking old abuses in the region to the Campbell surname. He said that as a man, he couldn't pretend he didn't know. As a priest, he couldn't use the altar for the benefit of only one. And, as someone who still had some respect outside the village, he had already begun arranging the shipment of copies to an acquaintance in the larger city. He didn't promise immediate justice nor exemplary punishment, but made it clear the story could no longer be pushed under the floor of just any kitchen. Otis tried to disqualify the words, saying Dead Man's paper was worth nothing, that this was stuff of people wanting to cause trouble, that a good priest took care of mass, not accounts. He went so far as to accuse Rosalind of ingratitude for having been welcomed on his family's land and still meddling with what wasn't her problem. Mrs. Beatrice, who had been listening silently, took a step forward and, with the frankness of someone who feared losing nothing because she had already given all she could in life, replied that her problem was all the neighbors who had lost crops, homes, and peace because of paper signed without understanding. Paper fixed up by overly clever folks. She said that if anyone there was meddling where they shouldn't, that someone wasn't the old woman who just wanted a roof and dignity. One of the men who had come with Otis, hearing his own surname cited by Father Luke as a descendant of a family harmed in the old transactions, began to shift, uncomfortable. Until that moment, he had imagined himself only as a strong arm at the service of whoever paid. Upon realizing that, perhaps, he also carried on his back part of the humiliation of his own. He lowered his head and stepped away a few paces, as if he no longer wanted to be part of that scene. The other, less reflective, still exchanged attentive glances with the boss, awaiting a clear order. But surrounded by so many witnesses, knowing the priest could write, that stories could travel in letters, that the children of those present would grow up hearing this, Otis assessed that any more violent gesture that night would be too costly. He then retreated through speech. He said that conversation wasn't over, that he would resolve it by the law, that it wasn't just any scribbled paper that would stain a family name. He threatened again, veiledly, mentioning the situation of those who depended on credit at the store, how much harder things could get. But the tone was no longer the same as someone entering a house thinking they rule everything. There was now something angry and at the same time contained, like someone realizing they lost complete command of the scene. He left the porch without saying goodbye, mounted his horse with sharp movements, signaled for the men to follow him, and disappeared down the road, taking with him the certainty that, from that night on, every time he picked up a pen to write a new agreement, someone somewhere might be ready to ask where such security came from. When the sound of hooves faded toward the hills, the silence left in front of the house wasn't of fear anymore, but of a heavy relief. Rosalind almost felt her legs fail, and only didn't fall, because Gus, attentive, approached and held her arm, helping her sit on the bench beside the door. The cold continued cutting, but the heat of so many lanterns lit by people who chose to be there warmed the environment in a different way. Mrs. Beatrice approached, squeezed her hand tightly and said, with the sincerity only the old have the courage to use, that she didn't imagine seeing in the final stretch of life a woman of her own age standing up to a man like Otis with such firmness. In that moment, Rosalind's moral dilemma found the answer that had been germinating little by little. She understood with her whole body that what she had in her hands wasn't just a chance to improve her own old age, but a rare opportunity to break a piece of the cycle that had crushed so many people before her. She decided there that the coins wouldn't be turned into luxury nor dry revenge, but into a tool. She agreed with Gus, Father Luke, and those present that part of that money would be used, yes, to ensure the regularized purchase of a central piece of the farm in her name, giving the minimal security of her own roof, and that another part would be set aside for something that served precisely those who suffered most from abandonment. Widows, elderly folks thrown into corners of houses, women without resources. In the following weeks, despite Otis's resistance in bureaucratic channels, the priest secured support from a contact in the larger city to mediate a simplified purchase. Using old possession documents and neighbors' testimonies to prove no one, besides Rosalind, was really interested in living there. It wasn't a clean or quick process, but slowly the paper moved from the place of threat to the place of protection. At the same time, they began, discreetly, a small community fund with the remaining coins, kept in a locked box at the parsonage, with handwritten records of every entry and exit, taking care not to repeat Ernest's story of poorly kept secrets, but without throwing everything into the hands of the same type of people who had taken advantage of him. Rosalind's transformation began to be seen not only in how she walked more upright, but also in the way she spoke of herself. She no longer presented herself just as the old lady who lives on the haunted farm, but as someone who had a home, a name on the land, a function in what was being born there. She continued washing clothes and sewing because the habit of work didn't abandon her, but she began to dedicate hours to a new project, a kind of halfway house inside the farm itself, where simple mattresses were placed in a side room, where a wood stove lit almost all the time, guaranteed at least one hot meal for whoever arrived with nothing. Widows who had lost their place in ungrateful children's homes, elderly tired of sleeping on porch benches, women with small children fleeing brute husbands, found there a floor where, for the first time, someone said they were necessary, even if just to share conversation at coffee time. The village, little by little, got used to the idea that Sunken Rock Farm was no longer an abode of curses, but of welcome. At first, folks went with hesitation, thinking it was a passing thing, that soon a new misfortune would fall upon whoever dared mess with that land. Over time, however, the signs accumulated, fewer fearful whispers, more stories of people who ate again thanks to a plate from Rosalind's kitchen, more clothes hung on the line showing the place, once empty, now harboured life. Children who previously avoided the road passing near there began to play in the yard, running among the moss-covered slabs, climbing trees, making the farm the setting for new memories that had nothing of hauntings. Meanwhile, news came and went from the city regarding the documents sent by Father Luke. There was no overnight revolution, nor confiscation of fortunes in the public square, but the simple fact of having outside eyes examining the history of how certain lands had changed owners made Otis's power begin to crack. People who previously accepted any credit condition with heads bowed began to demand everything be noted clearly, that no number be altered later. Some farmers sought on their own to review old papers, ask about titles they didn't even know existed. Otis still held much control, but he could no longer act as freely as before because he knew any false step could be used against him in conversations crossing roads. Time passed. With every winter that arrived, more blankets were distributed from the money remaining in the community fund. With every summer, more people passed by the farm to help tend the garden, harvest what had been planted, learn something new. Rosalind, who at the start didn't know if she would live long enough to see any fruit of that effort, began to harvest changes within herself too. The old guilt of thinking she hindered her children's lives gave way to a kind of quiet firmness. She understood now that she had value for the simple fact of existing and having resisted. Loneliness, though it still appeared on empty nights when she remembered Joseph or when the children were small and nestled in her lap, came softer because it was compensated by the sound of voices of those who now called her not out of obligation, but gratitude. Years later, on a clear morning in 1895, Sunken Rock Farm no longer looked like the same place she had entered with fear, suitcase, and box under her arm. The house, though still simple, had a fixed roof, walls whitewashed inside, windows that opened without creaking so much. There was an organized chicken coop in the yard, with hens scratching and scattering grain, a garden greening with stalks of collards, scallions, lettuce, cassava, a small corral where occasionally a cow lent by Gus provided fresh milk for the children's coffee. The dirt path to the village, once avoided, now saw more footsteps of people coming and going, carrying baskets of food, bringing news, asking advice, offering help. On one of these mornings, Rosalind was sitting on a wooden chair Gus had made by hand, under the shade of a tree near the porch. Her grey hair was pinned in a tidier bun, held with a simple comb she had received from one of the women sheltered there. The wrinkles on her face remained deep, marks of a life of sun, work and crying, but her gaze had a different shine, more serene. In her hands, she held a new notebook with a simple cover, where she noted in slow handwriting names of people passing through the house, dates they arrived and left, small stories she didn't want to see lost, like Ernest's almost was. Gus, greyer too, swept the yard calmly, pretending to grumble about the leaves falling without asking permission, but smiling with the corner of his mouth every time he saw a child run after another, laughing loud. Between one sweep and another, he cast glances of complicity at Rosalind, like someone who knows that even without a marriage paper or declarations aloud, their lives had intertwined in a way worth more than many promises spoken and unkept. Sometimes at night, they sat side by side on the porch in comfortable silence, watching the starry sky and listening, in the distance, to the chorus of frogs and crickets, sharing memories without needing to put everything into words. It was on one of these late afternoons, with the sun already setting slowly behind the hills, tinting the sky an orange that turned purple, that someone knocked at the gate in a familiar way, but changed by time. Looking, Gus saw a middle-aged man, worn clothes, crumpled hat, tired look. Beside him a woman Rosalind recognized immediately, despite the harder features. It was Julia, the middle daughter. Behind them, a little further away, came Arthur, without the same arrogance of years before, with a face marked by worries, empty hands, shoulders slumped like someone who perhaps had learned, the hard way, what it means to lose more than goods. Rosalind felt her chest tighten, a mix of joy, resentment, and care blending in the same thread of air entering her lungs. She didn't run to them, nor did she turn her back. She stood by the porch, waiting for them to come to her. Julia came first, with held-back tears, apologizing for having drifted so far, saying that with time she understood her mother's loneliness, because she also began to feel, with her own family, the weight of being seen only as someone who solves problems and not as a person who feels. Arthur took longer to speak, with a hoarse voice, admitting the warehouse where he worked had gone bust, that the debt with Otis, even diminished by his fall from power, had led him to a type of ruin that made him remember too much the night he put his own mother out. The old washerwoman heard everything, feeling every word hit places that still seemed wounded. She had every right to turn her back, to repeat the phrase that had hurt her so much, "I don't need you anymore." But time, the weight of the nights she welcomed strangers, the stories of other abandonments heard in her kitchen, all of this had softened some hard parts of her heart and hardened others in a wiser way. She didn't forget what she lived, nor pretended it didn't hurt. She said calmly that what they did to her didn't disappear as if nothing had happened, that day in Arthur's living room still echoed. However, she also spoke that she had learned, right there in the house nobody wanted, that worse than hearing "you aren't necessary" is spending life repeating the same cruelty with those who come after. She didn't receive them with a party nor immediate hugs, but offered a chair, water, coffee, a plate of hot food, as she did with so many others arriving there, carrying various shames. She made it clear that, if they wanted a piece of ground there, they would have to learn to respect who was already there, that she wouldn't be the mother who accepts any corner of a room and any crosswords silently anymore. Some days, conversations were rough. On others, good childhood memories surfaced between a scolding and another. Little by little, the space between hurt and rapprochement was filled by practical gestures. They helped fix a fence, carry firewood, harvest cassava. They didn't move back in with her as owners of the house, but became visitors bringing in their luggage, more humility than before. The impact of that choice not to repeat the violence reflected in the whole village. Seeing a woman who'd been rejected by her children choose, with criteria but without blind revenge, to leave the door ajar for a fresh start made many people rethink how they dealt with their own elders and their own mistakes. If Rosalind, who had 1,000 reasons to turn to stone, continued choosing to be a home, even if now, with firm walls and doors, she decided when to open, who was the rest of the village to think they could continue treating father and mother like old junk? Conversations about this began to arise in the square, at the church door, in the back of the store, a store, by the way, where Otis's presence was no longer so solid. Years after the first shipment of documents, the merchant who one day entered Rosalind's kitchen with the certainty he controlled everything no longer exhibited the same posture. Some of his deals soured. People began preferring to buy at points a little further away, even with more difficulty, just not to depend so much on his conditions. Local politics, though still marked by games and interests, saw the Campbell surname lose strength in disputes for office. None of this erased the past, nor returned land taken decades ago, but it reduced the power to continue doing new damage in the name of old customs. And every time someone remembered the beginning of this change, Ernest's name appeared alongside Rosalin's, as if two ends of the same rope had finally held hands across time. At the end of it all, on a calm afternoon, when the sky was clear and the wind blew just enough to sway the garden leaves, Rosalind sat at the kitchen table, placed before her two notebooks. Ernest's, already worn at the edges, kept with affection and respect, and her own notebook, newer. With pages still blank, she ran a wrinkled hand over the old notebook's cover, like someone making a gesture of late thanks, and then opened hers, writing, with slow but decided handwriting, not just names and dates, but also small sentences about what she had learned. She wrote that no one is a burden when they find a place where they can serve as support to others, that hidden wealth only has value when it ceases to be a secret, that blood family can fail, but new ties can also be born of choices. When she finished writing that page, she closed the notebook slowly, got up, and went to the door. Outside, Gus was adjusting a rope on the corral post. Tommy and Rita, now grown, helped gather chickens. A newly arrived widow folded sheets on the line. The sun was setting behind the slabs that gave the farm its name, painting gold the stones that once frightened so many people. Rosalind leaned her hand on the doorframe, breathed deep the smell of food on the fire, of damp earth, of clean clothes on the line, and let a thought, simple and strong, cross her mind. The place nobody wanted had become, somehow, the proof that destiny holds, yes. Surprises, especially for those thrown away, thinking they were of no use anymore. That night, when stars began to appear one by one in the dark sky, she returned to the table, blew out almost all the lamps, leaving only one lit, and, before lying down, looked again at the old notebook and the new one. She understood that if Ernest's story had been buried under a kitchen floor, hers, now, was being written in the light, in front of other eyes. She smiled slightly without noise, and thought that if someday someone sat there to tell this story aloud, perhaps they would start the same way her life had turned on the road, with an elderly mother hearing she wasn't needed anymore, not knowing that, right there, destiny was making room for her to become essential for many people who hadn't even been born yet.